So hi folks, welcome to Allyship and Media Training this evening with James Demers. My name is Pam Rocker, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the director of Affirming Connections. We're based in Southern Alberta and we're supported by Chinook Winds Region, Pacific Mountain Region of the United Church of Canada, as well as Fish Creek Shared Ministries. And we are so honored to be able to do the work of queer advocacy, especially from a faith perspective. We work with faith communities in Southern Alberta and are connected with faith communities across Canada to advocate for the full inclusion of Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ folks in all places of worship and all places of society. So tonight we have a very special guest and a really exciting topic. As we all know, there's lots of things that are happening around us, and many of those things are quite troubling. And we've had a lot of requests from folks to have conversation around when we're advocating for 2S LGBTQ plus communities, how do we talk about it? How do we liaise with the media? How do we talk with the press? How do we approach having press releases? And how do we bring our allyship into that piece of the public square? So we consider this a piece of what we want to empower folks to do. We always encourage people, all people, including people of faith, to not just practice what they preach, but preach what they practice, to actually be out in the public square saying what they believe to be true. Because in the absence of that, the negative voices are the ones that get centered. So before we get going, I want to acknowledge that we come from all different places tonight. And so I invite you to share where you're at in the land that you're on in the chat. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that the land that we get to live, work, and play on is the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation within Alberta District 3, and all people who make their home in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Doing this work for me is part of reconciliation. It's a reminder that we are always in the process of conciliation and of decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our hearts, and not just kind of working in the ways that we are tempted to work in, the ways of supremacy and the ways of trying to grasp for power, but in the ways where we deeply honor each other, we accept the mistakes that have been made, and we seek to make them right. So in that spirit, I want to introduce our special guest today that I have known for a long time. James has been like in all of the grassroots everywhere in this work of advocating for our beloved queer communities for a long, long time, and has the receipts. And so I just want to share a couple of those receipts before we get started. So James has previously worked in the charitable arts sector for 14 years at the executive director level and serves as an EDI educator across many sectors, including healthcare, social services, tech, and organizational change. As a senior consultant with Canadian Equality Consulting, James supports assessments, facilitation, strategic planning, EDI tools, and curriculum development for clients. James is a gender and sexually diverse content expert, specializing in gender identity and inclusion, and active for many years in community development and cultural work. He has committed his life and career to uplifting queer voices, to build bridges of understanding, eliminate stigma, develop actionable empathy in the communities around him. So I consider James a real treasure, not only in Calgary, but I think on a national level. And James is involved in lots of things on a national level and always has time to connect with us and to so many other folks in the community. Every time I talk to James, he's like, oh, I just helped put a sound system together for this rally in some small town in Alberta. So we're really, really honored to have James with us tonight to lead us through this conversation. And James has shared that he is willing to take questions sort of throughout. So we do have a formal presentation, but feel free to put questions in the chat and I will posit those things to James as we go. Also, last but not least, James has been generous enough to donate his time to make this registration free. And so we encourage you, if possible, that you donate to the Alberta's Trans Affirming Legal Fund. We're taking legal action against the policies that have been proposed by the Premier here in Alberta, the anti-trans policies. So if you're able to, in thanks for being able to attend this event, you can donate an amount that you can to that fund, and I'm going to put that link in the chat. Without further ado, I turn things over to James. Thanks, James.
Hi, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I've been so thankful over the last couple of years that the people that I came out with and built community with and were messy with are now people that we are working together professionally to make this possible. And I want to recognize that I recognize a lot of you on that. Some people I've had phone calls with, some of you I've seen at protests, some of you I know are the backbone of the organizing that's happening in your small town or your spaces. And so I'm genuinely honored to be in the presence of people that are the reason that we're going to do this collectively together, right? This is not necessarily what I love to do. Is I love to teach. I love people. I have the capacity to provide that as part of what I want to put out into the world. But all of us collectively is going to take this information and make something powerful with it. So thank you for being here, and thank you for the thankless million emails picking up beer cans at 2 o'clock in the morning for $50 work that I know that we're going to continuously do. So it will all make a massive difference. And just in the career that I've had the opportunity to have, I've seen an enormous amount of change. So let's do this together. Thank you for making the time. So let's get into what we're going to talk about here today. I want to recognize, because many of us are leaders in our community. Does anybody know, because you're going to be called to do this, does anyone know why we do land acknowledgements in Canada? We know we should do them. We often understand that that's part of the structures of our public facing events, and we should integrate those voices into Pride. But does anyone know why we do land acknowledgements specifically? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. It's part of Truth and Reconciliation. In fact, it is one of the listed Truth and Reconciliation 94 calls to action. It's one of the early ones, right? Yeah. It's a sign of respect to Truth and Reconciliation. It allows us to put a bookmark into our ongoing responsibility in our relationship to our Indigenous nations, to moving forward collectively together. Truth is what is accomplished by things like the report, doing accurate reporting and reconciliation around the bodies of children found at residential schools. Reconciliation is when we find a way to create a path together to move forward collectively, right? Which is always the intention of nations meeting in a particular space. And land acknowledgements, a recognition of territory, for example, was always part of Indigenous protocol before first contact. And so an adoption of Indigenous protocol is a way to indigenize or to recognize opportunities to decolonize our structures within our formal system. So one of the things that I would recommend to everybody here is we, as people supporting a queer rights movement, we can't do any of this without recognition and the support of our Two-Spirit siblings, right? This is very, very important. It's especially important in the prairies, where things like Out Saskatoon as an institution and huge institutions around Red Deer are primarily supported by and comprised of Two-Spirit and Indigenous folks. And so our voices and the ways in which we speak have to recognize that, because we need to be building bridges of solidarity in that recognition. And as community leaders, we set the table for what that looks like for folks in our community. So I would recommend, if you get the chance to do a workshop around building your own land acknowledgement, or you're developing your comfort there, consider that a professional competency, which will always serve you in the kind of community building that you're going to do. And so as a trans person in this space, what I want to recognize here is that gender diverse people have thrived in Indigenous cultures around the world for thousands of years before the development of colonialism and the economic engine that drove it. And so I recognize that in the space where we begin to decolonize these structures, it actually provides even more space for gender diverse people to thrive in this way. And so this provides us an opportunity to lead in good ways and to find reasons to return to the importance of relationship as we move forward. Yes, and really, really good resource in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to listen to Michelle Robinson's Native Calgarian podcast, I would also very highly recommend that resource. She does amazing work and has fantastic interviews and really gives you practical concepts and ways to talk about this with your neighbors. So highly recommend it. The Native Calgarian podcast is excellent. All right, we've talked about me. So here's what we're going to go through today. We're going to talk a little bit about context. I want to give you some statistics. We are going to give you things that you can rely on in terms of structure. I'm also developing like a resource guide. So all of the statistics, the definitions, I'm going to put that together in a package that I'll send to Pam and we'll send out to all the registrants so that you have a backup reference just beyond this deck. So I'm going to do that as well. We're going to talk about gender diversity and internalized messages. Why are people coming after us and where does that come from? This is important to understand when we're dealing, because we are dealing with human beings and we're dealing with fear. And those are fallible and important things to keep in our headlights if we want to make a conversation about what hearts and minds mean for developing this argument, right? Then we're going to get into the tactics, my favorite thing, myth busting and media interviews. What's true? What is not? How do you get those messages across in the 30-second soundbite that you will be edited into? So we will talk about that in some level of detail. We'll then talk about how do we have difficult conversations with our family members and our neighbors. It's very different than the way that we're going to speak to the media. And then we're going to talk about upcoming bills and actions that you can do right now. And that's a lot of the requests that I've also been getting from people is what can we do right now? And so I want to be really clear up front. Developing this conversation, creating and enshrining the protections necessary for gender diverse people and for queer people in general is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. So these are competencies that we're going to apply over a longer plan, and it's going to require us doing this work sustainably. So one of the first things I want you to think about is, what are my coping methods? How do I take breaks? And how do I take care of my mental health? And you have to keep those on the table no matter what, because this is a long-term plan. And so you're going to need to be able to be as kind to yourself as you want the world to be to us. And so you keep that in your headlights because it makes a big difference for how long you can do this work in a sustainable, good way. How's everybody doing so far? I'll make jokes, I promise. We'll get there. We'll get these pieces. Okay, so let's talk about some context. I'm going to talk here for a minute about the expected population growth in Canada over the next about 16 years. This is important because it's going to impact the structures and the asks we need to make as taxpayers of our social services, right? So I want to set some groundwork for what we're working with. Okay, 2041, which is 17 years away. I'm sorry if that frightens anyone. It frightens me a little bit. The Canadian population right now is about 38.5 million people. By 2041, it will be 47.7 million. 52.4% of Canada at this point will be new immigrants or the first generation children of immigrants. 52.4%. We are a nation of nations in a very broad context, and that is only going to increase. This is quite important. When we're looking at the population of Indigenous folks, this is going to increase by almost 7%, so 1.8 to 6.8. What's remarkable about this is this is the most significant population growth for Indigenous people in Canada since first contact. This is a huge shift. And so this means that our neighborhoods and our neighbors are only going to become more diverse. This is the future forward. And so figuring out ways to bridge these relationships and create sustainable systems is going to affect all of us. In addition to that, the number of LGBT people, which is roughly, according to the census, and I think most of the queer people on this call know that this number feels low. Right now, the current census says there's about 4% of the Canadian population who identify as somewhere in the queer umbrella on that spectrum. This, by 2041, which is not that long from now, is going to become 12%, representing one of the largest voting blocks in terms of identity groups within Canada. So thank the bisexuals, by the way. They've really jacked our numbers up quite significantly. So props to bisexual women in particular who have made enormous headway in this area. Thank you so much. You kick ass. But dead serious, that's what the data says. I just think it's important to say out loud because we are otherwise somewhat unpleasant to bisexual women, and they are the reason we are going to win. So good for them. And we should appreciate them more. So that's one consideration here. So this is important now. The other thing we want to think about when we're looking generationally, especially when we're looking at LGBT elders, right? And this is important, is by 2068, the percentage of Canadians over 85 is going to triple. And so we are going to need to make real considerations for what sustainable, structurally well-developed long-term care for LGBT elders, residential school survivors, new immigrants, looks like. And that it becomes the real task of our generation in the next 25, 35 years. And so that's worth considering because even with the increase in immigration, we will have a significant labor shortage and the median population age for Canada, which is currently 25, will then be 45. So we are talking a very different conversation in terms of social service needs. In order to meet this, we need to begin building a social service network that can meet this challenge now. And so this is part of the reason that when we start seeing the dismantling of healthcare, trans people are a distraction from what is the dismantling of healthcare. And understanding that is very important to shifting the political conversation about what we deserve as taxpayers and as Albertans, which is important here. So there are a couple of pieces. And when we talk about propaganda and political distractions, that's very much how queer people are being used right now. It's a popular leadership stigma, or, right? Popular leadership stimulus within the UCP right now. And there's a leadership race for them in February, in the fall. So this is part of why this has been announced when it has. All right. Context for queerness. I think this is really, really good, especially when you'll often hear people say like, oh, well, queer people have rights in Canada. It's not a big deal. That happened a long time ago, right? We dismiss that experience. And so I want to talk about this in a much more realistic context. So an individual who was born in 1944, they would be 79 in 2023, in their lifetime were affected by laws in Canada. And this is the other thing. A lot of the stats that you're hearing in this misinformation are coming from the States or completely made up. Make sure you're asking for Canadian statistics. It makes an enormous difference in the ways in which we do service provision. So in Canada, this person would have been criminalized until they were 25. Their sexual orientation would have been seen as a mental illness until they were 35. They were not protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms until they were 51. They would have lived through the devastation of the AIDS crisis from the age of 41 to the present day. This has not ended, especially globally and in broad reaches. They had no legal rights to marry as a gay or lesbian person until they turned 61. And for trans or gender diverse individuals, their gender identity and expression were only added to the Canadian Human Rights Act and the criminal code protections put in place when they were 72. So this is our modern context. And this is why this becomes really quite important. I want to highlight Lois and the Rainbow Elders on the side, because any excuse to talk about them makes me really happy. But it's really important that we make deliberate inroads to create intergenerational conversations, because we lost 2 generations over the AIDS crisis. And then we were prevented from speaking to each other because of homophobia and transphobia, especially through the 90s and into the 2000s, right? So the significance of something like the It Gets Better project is it started to create inroads where we could speak to LGBT young people, the people that we used to be, and start providing that kind of support. Breaking the connection between LGBT communities and LGBT young people is the goal of this kind of propaganda. And we fought long and hard for this, and we need to start building bridges on both ends of that spectrum so that we can repair the people that we lost and provide opportunities for the people that are coming. And so there are 2 ways that we can help support this. Healthcare across the board is something we can advocate for very consistently that helps both groups. So we do want to look at broadly, what do we deserve and what are we willing to fight for with great clarity? And so this is really important. We can help both of those groups of people. And Lois Sepp is incredible. If you've never had a chance to meet her, you should. All right, so let's talk about gender roles. We're familiar with these ideas, right? A lot of the ways in which queer people have been propagated against have been our defiance and broad spectrum of gender roles, significantly so. So what I want to talk about here is generally we assume that this comes together in personality traits, domestic obligations, occupations, we make kind of assumptions. And then those lead into things like physical appearance and cultural dress. This often changes significantly over time. So for example, pink was the color that baby boys were sent home from the hospital in the 1950s. It was considered a strong masculine color, and baby dresses and gowns were very, very common. You can see a lot of Franklin Roosevelt's pictures of him in baby dresses, which kind of look like toddler drag in a modern day context. But the ways in which this has changed over time is quite significant. So who here drinks beer? It's not a trick question. Nothing bad will happen to you, I promise. Okay. Now, what if I told you that for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, women were the primary purveyors of the creation of beer? And what changed was economic jealousy, primarily. So if we go back to Egyptian times, of course, we can see where this is quite normalized. In the ancient world, beer was a lot safer to drink than water because you have to boil barley to make beer. And so without the understanding of microorganisms, they were creating much safer liquids. And beer at the time was more chunky. And so it had a lot of vitamins and minerals in it. It was more like a chewy, thin soup kind of combination. And it actually provided an enormous amount of nutrients It was especially important in lots of places in medieval Europe. And so you would generally in a household would make bread and beer simultaneously because these two things were connected. But after the Black Death, right after the plague killed two-thirds of Europe, it broke down the family structures. Whole families had been wiped out, or sections of families. And so what started to happen is largely women would begin brewing beer independently for whole villages. For 150 people, you've got a one person or two-person operation, right? And it provided an absolutely necessary substance that provided a gap in the social structure, which had been destroyed by disease, right? Something healthy that everyday regular working people needed on a regular basis. But picture this for a second, right? You have a single woman in a cottage who has an enormous cauldron where she's making, 45 or 50 liters of beer at a time. There's a lot of barley around, which of course attracts mice. And so you add a couple of cats to that equation. And then when the beer is actually made, you generally wear a fairly tall hat to market so people can see where you are because everybody needs to pick up beer from you. And do you see where I'm going with this picture? So, yeah, these women were called alewives, which was a profession. It was a trade, like being a carpenter, right? Especially back in medieval times, they were essential. And they started building economic power quite significantly. And so even up until today, one of the most common one of the most common visual trade professions that are represented in cathedrals are alewives. But they are often pictured holding a flagon of ale, dressed as a witch, riding on the shoulders of demons because they were demonized by the church primarily for their economic power. So I'm going to put this link in the chat just so that you can check this out later if you're curious. So there's a wonderful historian, a lesbian historian named Heather Hogan, who's been tracking this story for some time and talks about the development of the fear of women developing economic power in the 1300s, leading to the witch hunts of the 1600s, and more specifically to the demonization of professions which were primarily filled with women. Nursing, healing professions, right? The development of doctoring, the replacement of midwives. We see this continuous development throughout economic history. And so this is a really interesting way for us to talk about when we look at gender stereotypes and we look at the ways that we create stereotypes about each other. What are we actually doing? Usually we're interfering with one's ability to generate or create independent economic power. And when we do that in a gendered way, we create the effects that we live with in a broad context. But I like to think the feminist history of beer is a really good place to start for that conversation. So when we see gender stereotypes in our world, this provides an amazing opportunity for us to do something in little ways, in small conversations or creating context for someone that can be really important. So you can point it out, right? Even something like media literacy with teenagers. So Riverdale might be a really interesting example, but pointing out appropriateness in relationships or the way that people speak to each other, giving people context for the real world versus the things that they're seeing online or in media. Just being that person can create an ongoing conversation that's important. And then being a living example, right? How do you respond to gender identity and gender diversity in general? I often say the most significant thing that cisgendered people can do for gender diverse people is to have a meaningful and deliberate relationship with their own gender identity, because a lot of the transphobia and homophobia that we experience in the world is about an individual's anxieties about the freedom or opportunities we represent that they are afraid of in some capacity. Sometimes that's a lack of control. Sometimes it's a deeper seated emotion. But if you have a deliberate relationship with your gender identity, you're less likely to be threatened by people who express theirs in a different way. And it creates a really powerful relationship that is yours, that no one can take away from you. So as a trans person, we're forced to develop that relationship with ourselves because we have to tell all these cis people about it to get healthcare, right? But as cisgendered people, often we can live adrift from our gender identities, especially when they align with societal standards that reinforce these ideas all around us. But the last time that you got ready to go out somewhere and you felt really good, that settled feeling, that's called gender euphoria. And we all have the opportunity to experience that. And in that moment, that's when you are the most connected with who you are as a person. And so it's important to create an understanding of what parts of your gender identity do you perform because they make you feel great and connected and grounded? And what parts of your gender identity do you perform for other people? And are you okay with that? Because sometimes we are. Sometimes there's things we do for family. And sometimes we aren't. There are things that are painful for us. And when we can make deliberate decisions about which part of gender we get to play with that make us feel connected and which don't have to apply to us, we're much less afraid of that flexibility and freedom in the world around us. So have a relationship with your gender identity. It's powerful and it's something that nobody can take away from you. and speak up if you have the opportunity to address. So, for example, it's far more powerful when I'm in a group of other men, how I interrupt or address a sexist joke when there isn't a woman in the room, right? And this is what becomes powerful about developing allyship in the places that you are. A lot of people in your communities will listen to you who might never listen to Pam or I, right? There's no way. And you are going to be the person who can have the conversation with them, who they care about and will give the benefit of the doubt to. And this will be all about how you approach them in a lot of different ways. All right, very quickly, gender affirming care was created when I use the term cisgender, I don't want to make assumptions. Is anyone unclear about what that term means? That's totally fine if you are. That's not a problem at all. Not looking, and no one seems to be panicking. So just very quickly, cisgender is a Latin prefix that means on the same side of. It just simply means that your gender identity and your sex assigned at birth are in alignment. If you've never really thought about it before, you're probably cisgendered. That's probably an easy way to think about it by and large. But gender affirming care was developed for cisgendered people. So it includes things like hormone and fertility treatment, including things like IVF, pregnancy supports, puberty and growth, circumcision, sexual health testing and monitoring, right? Research and public data collection, erectile dysfunction treatments. If we were banning Viagra, you'd believe we'd be having a different conversation, right? Eating disorder programs, mental health support, relationship and family counseling. There is an enormous amount of our healthcare that is actually related to gender affirmation, right? To supporting who we are as people, to allowing us to develop sexually and mature in our relationships in ways that are healthy long term. This is a cradle to grave component of who we are. The testosterone that I take comes from yams. And it's the testosterone that every cisgendered man takes if he has low testosterone, right? We are chemically identical. I can donate blood tissue and organs at the same rate as anyone else. We are all human beings at a fundamental level of chemistry. And so we have a broad conversation here about why are we restricting access to healthcare for some over others? That's really what it comes down to. Who those people are is actually somewhat less relevant. I think it's quite significant that they're children, right? But we are denying healthcare selectively on the basis of ideology, not evidence-based medicine, right? And so, because gender affirming care is evidence-based medicine that all of us access. So this is about selective discrimination. And so it's important that that's the kind of structure that we can put around it, because we need to talk realistically about what is being restricted. Feel free to ask questions as I go. And I had a lot of coffee today, so if I'm going too fast, let me know and I'll slow down. I promise I will. All right.
There's just
110%.
one
Yeah.
question, James. Someone asked, isn't the current policy in violation of the Canada Health Act?
Yeah, 100%. So right now, what's important too is it's proposed policy. They're probably going to table this in the fall in legislature. Why they did this early is so they could drum up support for Danielle Smith's reelection campaign within the party in the fall. So this is absolutely just a bait and switch kind of process. What it did, though, is it did the very dumb thing of giving us all of Pride season to organize. So here we are. And that's what we're doing. But yeah, it's absolutely a violation of the Canada Health Act. It's a charter violation. There's a variety of things. And in the conversations we've been having with the legal teams that are looking into this, the reason that nothing has happened yet is because it hasn't been tabled. So until it is law, there's nothing we can do about it. Right now, it is just a threat. It's an official threat. This is probably an easier way to look at it. And so as soon as it becomes something that we can challenge, we will be off to the races, and that the machinery behind that. And thank you to everyone who has donated. The legal fund has been unbelievably generously supported across the province, and we would not be able to do that without you. It has been incredible and very heartening to experience. So thank you. And I will highlight some other organizations, particularly Red Deer Pride, and I want to highlight Westlock Pride, who are looking for donations and absolutely need support. And a couple of dollars will make a huge difference. It'll mean the world to them. So if we can pour our Tim Hortons money into Red Deer Pride and Westlock Pride, we will make a big difference for those folks. So let me give that heads up as we continue on. But yes, legally, there's no grounds here. This is not about winning a legal challenge. It's about creating an atmosphere of fear, and it's about distracting from the other things that they are trying to do, like the provincial police force and stealing your pensions. So the points of as we're going to talk about key messaging, is collectively as Albertans, what are we moving forward on, and why are we using marginalized people as a distraction for what's going on here? Yeah. Yeah, and the collateral damage is massive, right? In the same way that when COVID struck, we saw increased things like domestic violence, right? When people are isolated from each other and afraid, we lose those social services, that goodwill. And so we need to creating that goodwill in each other. Hard conversations are going to be the way we do that. So context, I want to talk a little bit about queer rights globally, particularly if you happen to be working with populations of LGBT immigrants. You need to be especially careful about who knows their status in any context of their identity, because this can be very dangerous for LGBT immigrants on a global scale. They may only be able to be out in your community program and not to the person they're sharing a home with, or the family they're living with, or the program that they're in that's helping with their immigration process. And so you really always want queer people who are coming to Canada, fleeing from places where they've experienced persecution or have complex family structures, they really need to lead the care plan or the support that we can provide to them. So let them lead, have an open conversation. So similar things, I often say when I'm in session, I'll say, let me know your name and pronouns if you're comfortable. And I don't say that so that like Dave in the back can be a dick about it. I say that so that an immigrant in the back or a teenager or an intern, right, who doesn't have control over where their computer is and may not have control over their technological safety, they can choose what is safe for them. And that will always be relevant to our communities and our workplaces. So that level of we don't know where people are at in terms of their outness is very important. So a question you should always ask of somebody who comes out to you is, can I ask who else knows? So that you know what their sphere of safety is. That is a very important thing to think about when someone is trusting you with information. Make sure that you don't create a situation where you accidentally out them and make them unsafe through your best of intentions. So can I ask who else knows? Very, very helpful. Doesn't matter what age they are either. We don't want to make that assumption. So there are a variety of countries that carry the death penalty. Yeah. And North America, yeah, Ghana's recent announcement is really brutal. And yeah, homophobia and transphobia can be and has been for a long time a North American export, in particular in places like Uganda. This has been ongoing for about 30 years. It's been a very complex relationship. So, having said that, though, the place that has been given the most stringent travel advisory for LGBT people, it's telling them not to go there because they may not be safe, is Florida. So we could also don't want to get into the trap of not assuming that we might be creating the conditions of which people are being made unsafe much closer to home than what we think of as places far, far away. So there's a couple of different pieces of context here. When you're working with LGBT refugees, oh yes, when you're working with LGBT refugees, let them lead their sphere of influence and safety, and that will be essential to keeping them safe in the times that they need to, right? We all have complex journeys. All right, internalized messaging. This is really important because it is very hard. I've spent a lot of time across the street from people screaming in my face in my whole life, but in particular in the last few years. It is very hard to build empathy for people who are creating nothing but hatred and fear in us, right? And making things difficult. And particularly if we are a parent or an advocate and we are advocating on behalf of, then that anger and that response and that emotional labor can be even more intense for us. So let's talk a little bit about where this tends to come from. We also can't make the assumption that everyone who hates us is also gay. Like, thank God, because we don't need that. But there is internalized homophobia is important, and we do need to have conversations about where the experience of our community threatens power structures and where those power structures come from. So when we grow up in a society, as many of us know, where we are taught values that are homophobic or heterosexist, then we learn negative views about homosexuality, right? For those of you that are in queer communities, there's no hierarchy in queer communities, right? Not based on identity at all. That's never been a problem in like legislation or party planning or organizing pride. Never. Right? We have complexities within our own communities. There's racism within our communities. There's sexism within our communities. We're human beings, right? And we strive to do better than that. And we strive to create spaces that recognize that. And we do the best we can with the tools that we have. And that's all that could ever have been asked of our elders or generations of the past, or the new young people who are going, this is unacceptable to me. What do we do about this, right? Thank goodness that we all create this movement and inertia that moves us forward collectively. So I was in a meeting probably about 15 years ago with a bunch of kids in gay straight alliances that was held for center sexuality. And me and another adult, which is important about this, got into an argument about the word gay versus the word queer. And one of the 13-year-olds, bless them, interrupted us and said, listen, we just want to have a club. We don't care what you call it. And I've never argued about that word ever again because that kid was bang on correct, right? We were arguing about the wrong things. And so we can create bridges of understanding between each other, but moving forward together is actually a bigger, broader tent than we feel otherwise most of the time. So this can lead to negative feelings, right? We can have this within things like within our own sense of masculinity. We can feel uncomfortable or we can feel a sense of self-consciousness. And so when we have this relationship with gender, it helps. But signs of internalized homophobia and transphobia. Tell me if this sounds like anyone you know. Open contempt sometimes involves distancing by engaging in homophobic behaviors, ridicule, harassment, verbal or physical attacks against queer people, right? Engaging in obsessive thinking or compulsive behaviors. Sometimes you will hear people say that bigots think a lot more about gay sex than any of us do. This is a good example of that, right? Where they're obsessed with the sexualization of queer people and not the humanization of queer people. And that is a good point to come back to. Why are you sexualizing children? Let's talk about who is creating this circumstance, right? Yes, methinks thou doth protest too much. Yeah, Shakespeare knew. He knew, right? Underachievement or overachievement. So when someone is in danger, they may minimize their presence in a space or way overshoot it, right? And so we can see this. Some people will overshoot it in such a way where they will become the most conservative person in the room, the most homophobic person in the room, but from like a principled position, right? In these variety of ways, or they will just completely collapse in on themselves, remove themselves from social situations, not reach out to people. This can create isolation in lots of different ways. So there are considerations here. Another one that happens within our own communities, and this can be really complicated. We need to pay attention to this because if we see interruptions in trans healthcare, this kind of jealousy is going to be poisonous for us. So we need to have empathy for each other, but open contempt for members of the community who are further along in their journey or further along in their sense of self-acceptance. I'm not that gay people or those gay people. We need to deal with that wherever we see it. We need to find ways to create that empathy between us. There's no hierarchy in what it means for us to collectively have rights and thrive and create the future we deserve to have. We can all find an excuse for us to be together at the finish line, not figuring, we're not ranking it. We need to just get there together. So those kinds of things are really important. Get rid of the hierarchies of what it means to be in your head. You are exactly the person you're supposed to be. And it's incredibly valuable that you walk the path that you're walking. So take the resources, but feel free to be creative, right? One of the most incredible things in my life has been watching queer elders begin to identify as gender fluid in their 70s. I can't fathom what that experience, that collective lived experience to continue to learn about yourself all the way through all the things that we've seen in the last 60 years of LGBT activism, to continue to bring a gift to the table. That is the beauty of continuing community, right? And choosing to show up and do this work. All right. Because I'm going to put some stats together, I'm not going to pour through these statistics. We know that they're intense. I put them here so that you can use them as a data source. So I'm going to put this in the resource guide. We don't necessarily have to dwell on these significantly, but I want to particularly dwell on one. I do want to talk about a couple of stats here. So when trans kids have a lack of support at home, which are the people that are in the most danger, and we all know that, it's a 6 times increase in their suicidal ideation. It's the most dangerous consideration when we're talking about these numbers. In addition to that, and when I talked about recognizing our two-spirit siblings in particular, because we see this in Canada in a slightly different way, we want to recognize that when we look at homicide victims for people who are trans, 72% of them are trans women of color. And so where we can recognize intersectionality, we need to build additional supports into those spaces and recognize that even though we all experience a level of oppression and complexity in the world, it may hit us in different places for different reasons throughout our life, throughout our journeys. But if we can find opportunities to protect those of us that experience the most, this is the rising tides lift all boats, and we'll just blow up the yachts. That's a different conversation. This is exactly what it is, right? So we can create empathy for those spaces, because when folks who see the most difficult aspects of the failures in our system, when something gets better for them, we all benefit from that significantly. And so I think it's worth pointing that out, but also all advocacy, all opportunities to change the world are the most effective in the place you are right now, right? In your town, in your community, in your family group. We often think that we need to be part of something bigger. You are it. We are it. This is it, right? And so where you are and what you're doing is the most powerful and impactful place you can be. And if that means focusing on regional groups of people or focusing on particular demographics that are important to your community, do it. Pride should look different in Medicine Hat than it does in Mumbai, and I hope it always does, right? This is where we meet each other in the middle of what our cultures bring to the table, which always has value. All right, we're not going to take a break. How's everybody doing so far, though? So far, so good. Is this helpful? Because now we're doing Jeopardy. Now we're getting into rapid fire. We're going to do microaggressions, myths, and facts. So I suspect you already know this. You will also get this information, but I want us to get really comfortable saying these things because these are the big ones. So let's get into them. All right. Common queer microaggressions. Not all queer people love RuPaul's Drag Race, and that doesn't make them less gay. Some of us like hockey, not me, but some of us do. Allegedly, I hear these things. So, right, hockey players, not hockey. But this is really important because the way that people express their queerness is more individual than it is communal. And so we all desire community and finding ways to connect, but we want to avoid stereotyping someone's cultural interests whenever we possibly can, right? So get to know the person, and then if you end up at a drag race screening, welcome to gay sports. It's a blast. Demanding proof of sexual orientation. This often comes across as, you're too pretty to be a lesbian. Don't let those comments slide. Yes, yeah, we go. A couple of people are like, yeah, that feeling. It's not a good feeling. So don't ever demand proof of sexual orientation. No one actually owes you that. And this comes into the position of, if we're going to create an advocacy position, then we should have a conversation about what it means to out people before they're ready, whether we agree with their politics or not, which is very, very complex. So that's a conversation I'm in a parking lot because there's a broad, everybody gets to pick their position on what that means, because there are different circumstances for different levels of hypocrisy. And we've seen that throughout queer history. It has acted differently in different ways. Disrespecting queer spaces. If you are going to a cultural space of any kind, but this works really well for gay bars, but it's also great for powwows and cultural festivals, think about it like a birthday party. It is a party. You are an invited guest, but it is not your birthday. So please do not get drunk and throw up in the punch bowl, right? So when you're invited to a cultural space, you are there as a guest. Have a great time, eat the food, engage in the culture, but you are a guest. And so there is a level of decorum that is appropriate when you are in cultural space. It is a good way to think about it. It's an easy way to explain it to your relatives before you go to the bachelor party. And that is a great way to give people a sense of, how do we respect queer space? So please don't do 9 tequila shots and hit on every woman in a 5-block radius. It's exhausting, right? So if we can avoid that, it makes a big difference. Similarly, if you're going, for example, to a powwow with an Indigenous community, make sure you know whether or not that event is dry. It would be super inappropriate to bring alcohol to a space like that, right? So there should be cultural considerations. There are lots of different communities across the prairies where this is the case. Applying insensitive humor to sensitive subjects. You are allowed to have boundaries. You do not need to attend every argument you are invited to. Ergo, if somebody says to you, my pronouns are an attack helicopter, that conversation is over, right? That is, right? This is an attempted derailment, and you are allowed to say, that is inappropriate. You're welcome to pass on the question, and then you can move on, right? So give people the opportunity to pass, but do not accept those kinds of derailments as someone having a genuine curiosity. You know exactly what's happening in that moment. It is 100% appropriate to respectfully treat adults as adults in that circumstance. So that conversation in that circumstance is over, right? Does someone know who I'm quoting there with the attack helicopter reference? It's Ricky Gervais. So invading a queer person or trans person's bodily privacy or autonomy, real easy. If you don't want a stranger to ask you that question, don't ask us. This feels like a basic principle, but one of the dehumanization tactics that is used is freak showifying, right? Or creating gratuitous conversations around things like surgery and medical procedures and on and on and on, right? Talking about trans surgery as mutilation. This is also an invasion of space, but often it can be impertinent questions. So it's perfectly acceptable that someone's medical process is their own. When we get friendlier with you, I promise we'll probably never shut up about it. But in the immediate conversation, it's totally okay to say, like, that's really inappropriate. Don't ask people that, right? And that's just a good way that we can adjust our behavior. Assuming sexuality based on performance, someone's gender presentation has nothing to do with how they like to have sex or who they like to have sex with. If we have learned nothing as a community, then that's true, right? So, I mean, I work with drag performers. They can be lots of people in 25 minutes. So This is really important. We don't want to assume that gender identity tells us anything about someone's desire for intimacy. This is especially important when we look at asexual and aromantic communities, because we make a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of invisibility around those identities. So worth thinking about. And then standing by when somebody is dead named or misgendered. Now, I want to do this on a slightly different level. I think most of the folks on this call understand that we want someone to be gendered correctly. It can be very helpful to say, like, oh, hey, and correct people on their behalf. But I want to talk about this in a more serious way. So, as you may have guessed, I'm trans, and so is Caitlyn Jenner, and we have very different politics, super different, in fact. However, that does not give me the right to make fun of her transition, to dead name her, or to be cruel to her in any way in regards to her transition because I disagree with her politically. On the left, we can be mean to each other. And so I want us to hold each other to a higher standard of not dehumanizing people we disagree with, because we will completely implode opportunities to have these conversations. Now, I also recognize some of the people that we disagree with treat us like garbage. There are strategies for that, but this, in very much in the same way, when we're looking at the tactics of the civil rights movement, they chose nonviolence not because it was easier, not because it was safer, but because it worked. And so what we present has to be within a set of principles wherever possible. That does not mean you're a doormat. That does not mean you deserve to be abused or harassed. There are distinctions between those things. I think it's really important that we are allowed to have boundaries in the same place where we are pushing them. Oh, I moved all my windows. The heck? Oh, okay, we're good there. All right, sorry. All right. When you're addressing microaggressions, it's really, really important that you first decide whether or not you. So, when I said earlier, you do not have to attend every argument you're invited to, decide if it's even worth it. 99.9% of the time, a comment thread is not worth it. It's not where you necessarily need to put your energy. Letters to the editor, absolutely. Google reviews for boycotting businesses that are homophobic, absolutely. Writing letters to your MLA or MP, fantastic. A Facebook comment thread, probably not worth your time. Because remember, people are making money on making you angry, and that is probably not the best venue for you to spend that energy. There are lots of other, and I'm happy to, we'll give you lots of stuff, but there's lots of other places you can spend that. De-escalate where possible. You want to clarify the perpetrator's statement. So when you're approaching someone, this is when you want to upgrade their language, you want to clarify what they said. One of the most useful sentences is, I appreciate that that wasn't your intent, but we need to have a conversation about your impact, right? Recognizing that intent is always part of human communication. Most of us do not intend to say something cruel or discriminatory towards someone, or if we do, maybe it's a lack of language on our part, a lack of understanding about how to articulate that. You see this a lot with how the media reports on gender identity. So very important, recognize their intent. I appreciate that that wasn't your intent, or that your intent was good. You want to support this person. You were excited that they felt comfortable in the workplace, right? These kinds of conversations, but we need to address your impact. There's a safety concern here. They hadn't told very many people. You used a word that can mean this. So can we upgrade our language and we'll do this differently in the future, right? So intent versus impact. Yeah, exactly. We will talk about that 100%. Oh yeah, the conversation is over. So you can set boundaries. Actually, when we get into, I'm going to come back to this, Michelle, because we will talk about this when we're talking about neighbors, coworkers, and family members. Very different boundaries. The internet is a very different, right? So comment threads, don't worry about setting boundaries and just shutting that door. It's not worth it. Interpersonal relationships, we'll talk about how to do appreciative inquiry with those kinds of conversations. All right, let's get into some myth busting. Okay, Jeopardy off the top. Sexual orientation and gender identity can be changed. They can't. And in Canada, it's a criminal offense. And that is the open and shut of it, right? And Pam knows this, and many of you I know did incredible work on the conversion therapy ban that happens in Calgary and across the country. And thank you so much. I was part of the group of people that spoke, and it was as somebody who did 8 years of conversion therapy. I never thought that that law would change in my lifetime, and I couldn't believe how angry I was once it was illegal about what had happened. And processing that over the last couple of years has been infinitely easier because of my incredible gratitude for the work that folks did. I was not on the chopping block or in the grind of doing that work, and many of you were, and I am so thankful. So thank you. It made a huge difference. Homosexuality is a Western phenomenon. So we talked about this a little bit with the Western export. Nope, gay people are everywhere. absolutely everywhere. We have exported an idea of visibility around gayness that absolutely has an impact around the world. And we can talk about how does the first one apply to youth? Oh, yeah, I'll come back to that. Thank you. We can go for that. So, when we're talking about this idea of homosexuality as a Western phenomenon, what we have is there's a branding that has come with pride that is a visual representation of Western LGBT identity to some extent. And so this, of course, is something that we need to decolonize in a lot of cases. So again, pride should look different in Beirut. It should look different in Boston. It should look different in Glasgow, because we should be able to infuse the culture and reclaim a lot of the cultural identities that were queer or were gender diverse in spaces before these conversations. But what it has done is it's created a global conversation. So queer people are everywhere, every era of human history, every corner of the globe, and we will continue to be everywhere, which is why the X-Men is a great comic book for queer analogies, if there's any nerds on the call. So sexual orientation and gender identity can be changed. So generally it can't, right? So sexual orientation, who you're attracted to, it may change over your lifetime because human beings evolve, but it cannot be therapized out of you. It cannot be frightened away from you. Who we are, this is not something that can be fundamentally changed. You can cause people to deny who they are. You can cause them to repress who they are. But ultimately, this always fundamentally comes to the surface. And that is as true of gender identity as it is about sexual orientation. And there's an enormous amount of and often where this comes from is we scare kids really, really badly, and then we have to deal with the effects of them when they become adults, and there are no boundaries around what they are exploring and the context in which they can explore that. It often leads to really self-destructive behavior, and so these things can come collectively together. So, but the truth here is, while sexual orientation and gender identity can change, it cannot be changed. That is an important distinction. So you discovering who you are over the course of your life may be different in different eras of your life, but inherently who you are cannot be impacted by outside forces. Hormone blockers. Yeah, no problem at all. Hormone blockers. So the myth is that they're used without parental consent and have irreversible effects. This is fundamentally untrue at a base and scientific level. They've been used for 40 years, mostly to treat cisgendered children who live with disabilities. So, and a good example of this is often young women who live with Down syndrome, for example. They sometimes, based on various conditions and chromosomal interactions, may reach what's called precocious puberty. So puberty that starts at 6, 7, or 8 years old. And in care settings, this can provide all kinds of safety considerations. And so we've been using hormone blockers primarily in kids like this and cisgendered kids who just happen to go through early puberty, which has actually been getting earlier over the last 20 years or so. And then, of course, intersex kids, for which puberty and hormone blockers are an integral part of their healthcare from essentially day one, right? Depending on what their healthcare plan is. These treatments are 100% reversible and considered safe. Accutane and Ritalin are far more unsafe for children than hormone blockers in any context. In fact, Accutane carries permanent risk of birth defects. And how many people feel great about the way that we use and prescribe and well, hold back the prescription of things like ADHD medication, especially in young children? We cause a lot more problems with those drugs than we ever have with hormone blockers. They're a vitally important part of healthcare. They have been tested for 45 years. They are scientifically sound and 100% reversible. Yeah, Accutane is an acne medication. It was originally developed for cancer treatment, which is why it's so powerful. And then it turned out it worked for acne, and now we prescribe it to children. So there you go. I say this as someone who used Accutane because of my transition and benefited from it. So complex relationships with medications is the reality of most of our experiences, right? Antidepressants, SSRIs, ADHD medications, even if we're looking at thyroid conditions, blood thinners, these are all important aspects of our biomedical health, right? And being able to talk about them in evidence-based ways and practical ways that serve us is our right. It's very important. Children are receiving surgeries or medical interventions without parental consent. They're not. All medical interventions on children require parental consent, and bottom surgeries, the one that we like to talk about as a form of misinformation all the time, are not performed on anyone in Canada under the age of 18. They are absolutely not. The stories you're hearing about this are from the States, and they have been largely debunked. So We're not working with real information here. This is about straight up propagandizing what is and is not happening. For those of you that have trans kids or have interacted with the medical process at any time, you are fully aware that accessing that process is resource restricted and incredibly complex. This is not an open door, easy to access process for anyone, and the resources have been way underfunded for decades and decades and decades. Gender ideology. This is about the politicization of language. Gender ideology was invented to stop the progress of movements that were supporting gender diverse people. That's it. Same thing with critical race theory, right? An academic term that means an enormous bastion of understandings from historical to sociological to social science context in a broad reaching form that has existed for 120 years in academic literature. In the same way, support for trans people at a medical level has existed for 80 years in scientifically proven, peer-reviewed literature and continues to be best practice in terms of medical science, according to the global and Canadian organizations which support this, which is WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgendered Health, WPATH. The Canadian version is called CPATH, the Canadian Association for Transgendered Health. And they have massive conferences every year, and that's where our data comes from. It's extremely stringent. So it's important to know that these broad organizations, professional associations of people working in this field, not only operate, but they operate at a high level at a global scale. Depriving queer people of their rights can be justified on the grounds of religion, culture, or tradition. Nope, that's not how that works. The UN agrees. The movement to support queer rights across the globe is complex. It looks very different in different countries and different cultures. It sounds different, and it must enact itself in different ways throughout different cultural understandings of those systems. And so this is a long-term project. And when the first Pride Parade happened in 1970, the promise was we would march, and this is why it's called a march in New York, we would march until queer rights, which at the time was called gay power, was global. And we haven't gotten there yet. And so when people ask you why we have Pride in Canada, we have Pride here for people in Moscow who can't. And that is as important, that we create the joy and light and opportunity in our worlds that other people do not experience, as it is to support them monetarily and fundamentally and provide that joy ubiquitously. So we march here because we're not done yet. We have a long way to go. There's lots to do. All right, and Pam and I worked on these. So there's a really incredible documentary I would like to recommend, particularly for folks of a Christian faith background, called Fish Out of Water. It's 60 minutes, it's animated, and it speaks to the clobber passages that are specific within the Bible that are often used against LGBT people. It's amazing. The director is incredible, and Pam and I got to know each other professionally by showing it in churches a number of years ago. So a lot of fun. So the Bible does not condemn homosexuality. Actually, no broad religious texts in significant ways do. Yeah, fish out of water. It's very good. And so it is not an excuse in any capacity to not build bridges in community with people. And particularly, it has no bearing on whether or not we receive healthcare or access to sports or are allowed to have our kids protected in schools. Right? None of these things have any bearing on this. In addition to that, and I like saying this very explicitly, if anyone is ever telling you that you can't be part of your faith or have a relationship to the higher power that is meaningful to you because of your queerness, they are lying to you. No one has a right to stand between your belief, your faith, and your identity. So this is very important, and I don't think that people say that explicitly to queer people very often. You have every right to have that relationship, and someone who is trying to take that away from you is wrong. So that's where one of those boundaries makes a big difference. Drag shows centered on family programming are inappropriate for the general public. So who here has been to a drag show? I suspect a few of you, at least a couple. Yeah. You've also been to like the movies, the theater, you've been to resorts in other countries, right? So we as human beings are pretty good at sorting out age appropriate, right? Rating systems and areas and context. We've got all these safe consumption sites called bars that children aren't allowed in because it's dangerous for them. Like we seem to be pretty good at sorting out how this works. So the idea that queer programming is automatically sexual, inappropriate for children, cannot be a component of family programming is no different than saying all movies are porn, right? this is the false equivalency that people are making. And so I think it's really powerful that we come back to, well, hang on a second, it's a form of entertainment, and like anything else, there are age appropriate forms of entertainment, and that's all that it ultimately is. So yes, not all movies are porn is a really short way to say that, if that's helpful. And then we worked, these are can be really quite specific. So we when we're working as queer people supporting members or we're in a faith community, we want to have these conversations in a little bit of a different way. And Pam, if you want to pop in here, you definitely can. We worked on these together. So I'd really appreciate your perspective on this piece.
So I think, there's a lot of folks on here that are faith leaders or come from faith communities. And I think it's important, especially because so many of the things that James has talked about already come from these sort of myths and disinformation, comes from, we would normally say like religiously motivated, but I actually would say religiously underwritten, sponsored by kind of. And so I think it's even more powerful and impactful when people of faith have a response, a religious response to these sorts of religious attacks. And so, we're about to get into sort of more of the media part. And so I think understanding some of this misinformation is important. So, for example, having conversations, being able to have open conversations and addressing some misinformation that comes up. Often we don't know what every single person in our community thinks. We don't know what kind of conversations they're having at coffee time, right? Um, so being really intentional to host conversations, to have events like this, to create an open forum where folks can maybe be curious or they can question maybe some of the things that they're being told. I think addressing when your faith is being used to target the community. I think there's I think for like sort of nice people of conscience, we can sometimes assume that people know, okay, well, we're not doing that. Like, obviously, we're different. But folks don't know that. If we're a part of a religious institution of any kind, no matter what kind of progressive reputation we think it may have, it still has those religious connotations. And just for folks' own survival, they can't take what we don't say at face value. So we have to be really intentional about differentiating our voice from those who seek to harm others by using religion. And I think, we are the ones who should be the first ones to call for accountability for faith leaders who are using this. It's one thing for, activists who don't have, a tie to a faith community to hold them accountable. We should, as people of faith, say, that's not what represents me. That is not okay. And that's what so many folks did, not only in a municipal way here in Calgary, but across the country, to say, as people of faith, we want to ban conversion therapy practices because of our faith. And we want to hold accountable people who are doing this in the name of faith, right? And I think showing up is obviously a huge piece, like I think it's my favorite thing ever when I see people of all different ages from faith communities wearing their rainbow scarves, they have their signs, right, at Pride and at protests and rallies. Your presence there is such an amazing public witness. And so there's a lot of ways, both, large and small, that we can leverage something that's so rooted and so important and sacred to us to leverage that for liberation for others as well. And so, having this piece of it is really important and something. So I'm going to hand it back to James, but I want to let you know in terms of the misinformation around drag, because James talked about that a little bit. We put together a drag FAQ with researchers and academics and drag performers where we kind of posited to them the most common disinformation around drag and gender diversity and that sort of thing. And so we have a comprehensive list of answers to these things. And that might be really helpful for you or people in your life, just to kind of clear up some things that may get kind of, muddied by things that we hear. So I'm going to share that in the chat right now as I give it back to James. So thanks, James.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you. It makes a big difference. Okay, So if you want to build relationships with queer communities, so you're like, come in and do a talk, or we would like to create a bridge between us and queer communities in your local area, right? If you're asking them for something, be extremely clear about the details of your request. Is it a paid opportunity? When is it going to happen? Is there flexibility in scheduling? A lot of people, as many of you know, who do activists in your communities, you're doing this on top of your full-time job and on top of taking care of your family. So if we can plan for people to need some scheduling flexibility, that'll make a big difference. Say up front if you're representing an affirming ministry or organization. Pam and I talked about this, and we talked about, and if you want to pop in here, please, but there's best practice here about why, which I think you talked about a little bit.
Yeah. I get questions all the time from folks saying, how do I connect with the, queer serving organizations in my community? Or I've sent them a note, but they haven't responded. And so this is sort of some best practices around that, because we do encourage folks to get involved in their local community to find out what's actually happening. So that way, when there is a local rally or protest, you're already connected with what's happening and the ways that you and your community can serve, right? So yes, be very clear, say up front what you believe. Again, don't assume that anybody knows that you're different from what the sort of dominant, not the majority, but the loudest voice is out there. Tell them exactly what you're asking for. And again, it's really important. A lot of people, expect queer folks to do things for free. They might offer to do it if they're able to, but if you can be able to resource somebody who you're asking to come into your community to tell a story or to teach something, it's important that you try to offer what you're able to. And understand that there are going to be some organizations or folks where it might take a long time to build this trust. It may not be something that happens with that particular person or organization, or it may be, a long journey, and that's okay. You don't need to take it personally. That's just a reality. That's what we live with. That's sort of the legacy that we carry with us as people of faith. And I'm not saying that that's okay with me, but we have to be okay with it if that's the choice that people make. But overall, I think most folks are really like thirsty for partnership and for like allies to come along. And so if you're really clear and you're able to, say who you are, what you hope for, and have flexibility on what that looks like, those relationships will start. And I've seen amazing faith communities in like small towns in Saskatchewan and all over the place, like have such robust, rich relationships with their pride communities all around Canada. So it's possible, and it's a win-win for both sides in supporting each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. It makes a really, really big difference. And it's all about relationship building, right? So offering venue space, creating opportunity, holding movie nights, all of that goodwill is generative. All right, let's get into this. So logical fallacies, rapid fire. There is a difference between logical and critical. This is very, very important. So logical is often common in debate and public discourse, media. We're arguing about ideas, right? The marketplace of ideas. That's a red flag if someone says that to you, by the way. It requires clear subject competence. So people are only generally coming from a place of their own expertise. Not all choices that are logical are equitable, right? So caring for, so it is yeah, so there's a variety. We'll get into this in a second. So not all choices that are logically true, Spock, are equitable, good for people, right? And so logic is not always king. We need to talk about critical thinking, right? We need to create empathy and clarity of context in the work that we're doing. So this operates a little differently. A logical fallacy is a reasoning that is logically invalid. It makes no sense, but it undermines the argument or creates a distraction. Lots of forms of communication contain logical fallacies, but they're generally not true. You see this as like figures of speech, for example. If you really dig down into them, they get kind of illogical very quickly. The purpose of these is they're used to create sound bites. They're a way to create information where someone can easily take that information and run with it, right? A lot of them, yeah, they can be used in good faith or bad faith. A lot of medias use this. We watch for it in interviews. Unconscious bias is a lot of ways that this can be brought in, but this also comes with popular myths and portrayals in media, right? So let's walk through these. Slippery slope argument. If we allow gay people to marry, we'll be marrying animals next. This is a logical fallacy. What this means is these two things are totally unrelated, but it was an argument used against gay marriage for a very long time. So this is an if then. So someone takes a if this, then this, right? So there are litter boxes in children's classrooms because kids are identifying as cats, 100% made up. And I have had to answer that question in corporate settings for 2 years. I'm sick of it. So this kind of if then, not true. Slippery slope. Non sequitur. Increased immigration will lead to white people being displaced. No, it won't. There'll be more people in the country, right? So this replacement theory is often a racist trope, and it's a non sequitur. What you are confirming here is just not true. Racist dog whistles are often found here, right? So this is the fear, right? The straw man fallacy, right? So everything will move rapidly downhill. So you represent an argument that you don't agree with, and then try to bring a lack of faithfulness to this argument. So trying to prove by over exaggerating. If we make the hiring process equal, then white guys won't have the same advantages we have now. And right? Yes, but also if we're leveling the playing field, then what that means is you're actually getting the same equality of opportunity as everyone else, right? Which is a reframing something that is being hyperbolized in a way that's not true. I'll also send you all of these as a guide, so you will get these as a reference point. Please don't worry about taking a ton of notes right now. It's Friday night. I'm not going to do that to you. I try to make people
Um,
gay people not do math in these sessions either.
James, there's just a question to just to share. What does racist dog whistle mean?
Oh, okay. So a dog whistle. So it's a metaphor for, so the metaphor is dog whistles it's a sound only dogs can hear. A racist dog whistle is a coded piece of coded language that people who hold racist beliefs will hear. Master race, lots of supremacy references, right, can lead into this. The Proud Boys are an example of this quite significantly. So, for example, family values is a conservative dog whistle that is anti-gay, right? So I'm a family values conservative. What that is saying is I'm a homophobic conservative candidate, right? So that is an example of a dog whistle. Anyone that's using the term perverts or groomers, right? That's a specific call to a specific kind of homophobic or transphobic organization. So this tends to be the language. Save Our Children is a homophobic and transphobic dog whistle that was invented by Anita Bryant in the 70s in response to legislation that was protecting LGBT people at the time in California. So very, very often, dog whistles are very, very similar in the way that they're used in moral panics. So, for example, the satanic panic, everything around the court case is related to that. Let kids be kids is a good example of a dog whistle that's currently being used, right? What about queer kids is the response to that. Okay, so if it's let kids be kids, then lean into that. That's a good way to be like, okay, well, let's talk about that then, right? Like, let's take you at your word. We'll assume that it's a good faith argument. Let's run through the logic of that. Yeah. Improper appeal to authority. Jordan Peterson's not an expert on trans issues, and neither is J.K. Rowling. So citing those people is a logical fallacy. They know nothing about trans people, and their opinions don't matter when we are talking about healthcare access for trans people in general, right? So improper appeal to authority. So for example, this is why professional organizations have been sending tons and tons of information to the government going, we don't support this. This is not scientifically based. We refuse to do this, right? So this is the natural professional response. What that does is when, for example, the professional association related to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, when they say we are opposed to these policies, what it does, because they're the licensing organization, is it protects doctors that refuse to follow them, because it's basically saying to them, you will not lose your license because we do not agree with this. And so those statements are vital. If your professional organization has yet to put one out, it's actually very important for legal precedent that they do so. When I send, I'm going to send a bunch of resources to Pam's Way to distribute to all of you. And we have a bunch of collected statements from Alberta that you can use in copy and use for myth busting that are new. I've got a whole bunch of information to back you up for resources after this. So improper appeal to authority. Jordan Peterson's opinion is irrelevant, which is nice to say. False dilemma. Christmas is being canceled, right? No, it's not, right? It's a false dilemma and creating this sense of panic, right? Either or fallacies. We must ban immigrants or our way of life will collapse. Either or. Massive extremes. Neither of those things are true, right? Right. If we give Indigenous people their land back, they'll run us all out of our homes. It's another way that you hear people say versions of this, right? If we eliminate gender, right, this idea that like, oh, we want all gender to be neutral, that's not true either. Gender is an incredible box of crayons. We just want all the access to all the colors. That's all we're asking for, right? We're not talking about invisibilizing or destroying gender. We're talking about being able to adopt gender into our worlds in authentic ways without barriers, right? And that's reasonable. And then the false equivalency. If you're transgender, then why can't you be transracial or trans species? You've probably seen versions of this, right? Total false equivalency. They have nothing to do with each other. One, you cannot transition your race. There's a broad conversation we do not have time to have about the logistics of that, but right, Rachel Dolezal is often the figure that comes up when people are investigating these kinds of conversations. And trans speciest, well, I know a person who turned themselves into a tiger. Like, okay. None of those have anything to do with why we're restricting children's healthcare in Alberta. They're a distraction. But the internet loves them. Personal attack, we're pretty familiar with this. Appeal to tradition, right? That's just how my generation is. We were raised like that and we can't change. The Rainbow Elders would tell us to the ends of the earth that's not true, right? We all have the opportunity, no matter who we are or where we are, to engage in this significantly. Yeah, we definitely can. I'll send you some more pieces. Okay, now you're talking to the media. The single most important thing about talking to the media, which is wildly different than your friends, your neighbors, people in your faith community, or anyone else at a protest. Other people at a protest and the media, still a totally different relationship. You are not having a conversation. They do not have your best interests at heart. You are playing a chess game. Your only job is to get your key messages into that microphone. It does not matter what they ask you. It does not matter if they try to make you upset or ask you a leading question. You could put into that microphone only what you want to be reported on the television. They can't edit something they can't edit you if you don't say too much and you say exactly what you mean. That's all they have, and that's what they have to put on TV, right? Or they've wasted their afternoon. So this is not a conversation, which is important. Doesn't matter what kind of media it is either. Everybody is selling the story. So first piece, be strategic. Think about what you want to share and how you will achieve it, right? So you also might want to consider the timing of the release of a press junket or a particular piece of information. If you're going to leak something onto social media, you want to consider when you want to do that, right? Friday afternoon is the highest traffic, for example. So look at when that becomes important to you. Be strategic. Pick one issue, have a key message about it, and do not deviate from that point. Your journalist knows nothing. Never be sarcastic. Never make side jokes, right? Because they will take it literally. Anything that you say can be used. You have to treat it that way. They're not on your side. It doesn't matter if they're also queer people. It doesn't matter what outlet they're from. You're there to do a job, and so are they, right? So, for example, when we did that massive protest in Calgary where 2,000 people showed up, I knew a lot of the journalists there, particularly the queer ones. We could not speak because they are there to do a job. And if we showed that we had a relationship, that would cause all kinds of problems for the legitimacy of that media. We're doing a job together. We can talk about it after the fact, right? So get in touch with your local media sources, tip them off when you have the opportunity. But remember, be strategic. They know nothing. You give them everything. Do not allow them to make assumptions. Be prepared. It's your interview. It's not the reporters. You are never doing a member of the media. I love people in the media. This sounds really intense, but not when we're doing activism. It's a totally different game. So be prepared. It's your interview, not theirs. You're not friends. You're doing a job, right? Decide in advance what you do and do not want to say. If they ask you a question you don't want to answer, you say no comment, right? It's not rude. They'll just cut that out in the editing. So don't worry about it. You're giving them content, control the content that you give them. It's really useful to write down key points. Bring cue cards with you. Put notes on your phone. Review them in advance. Just like doing any kind of report or presentation, make yourself the most prepared you can be, and don't assume that you have to memorize anything. Don't memorize anything. Keep the notes with you. Review them regularly. Get comfortable. Say them to your partner in the car. Make sure that you've said it out loud before you're saying it into the microphone, okay? Be concise. Don't tell a story, just deliver your key message, right? You do not need to give the media context. You're there to give them information. So lead with your key points, say them over and over again. So one of the things that I've said frequently to reporters is like, this is not about protecting children, right? Doesn't matter what they ask me if they're trying to go in that direction. This is not about protecting children. We're here to do this. We're deciding to do this. Then that's what they have to publish, right? Otherwise, they've wasted a lot of time that day. And it's about money at the end of the day when it comes to a lot of this. Anything juicy or sensational, decide if you want to use particular language, it will be aired, right? So be strategic about that. If you're going to say something audacious or specific or challenging, lean on it. Say it specifically and use the language that makes sense for a broad audience, fifth grade reading level maximum, right? Academic language turns people off. Find ways to say it in plain language, direct to people. Never be sarcastic. Try to avoid using pretentious euphemisms or references with your friends or in another context is fine. With the general public, you want to reach right in the middle of the general public. And then remember, you are always on a hot mic. It doesn't matter if it's off. It doesn't matter if they say they're not rolling. That's a lie. Assume it's a lie. It's not always, but you should better assume that it is. If you are in front of a camera, if you're within 10 feet of a microphone, if you have a microphone on your clothes, you are hot, which means you're being recorded. So side comments, side jokes, don't get off the interview and be like, oh, that fucking asshole. That's on the mic, right? You don't want to get caught in that scenario. Lots of people, famous people and people who do professional speaking every single day, they make this mistake. So if you're anywhere near the equipment, what you're saying is public and treat it that way. And then once you're out of there, it's not a big deal, right? So if you take this seriously, you come in prepared, you deliver your key message, and you leave when you're ready to, you will be great. And you're going to have a lot of adrenaline. It's going to feel intense the first time, which is why one issue, one key message, keep it short and sweet, only give them the soundbite you want them to have, right? No sarcasm. Keeping it simple, right? So you're speaking to a general audience, not a queer audience, right? Whenever you're speaking to the media. So think about who you are speaking to. Keep it as simple as you can. Don't throw a ton of information at the person. You're not trying to what's called walrus them. You're not trying to overwhelm them with information. You need them to understand one or two very clear points. So decide those. And then handling the tough stuff, off the record doesn't exist, right? So avoid answering loaded or ludicrous questions, right? And so often it'll be loaded questions or someone will ask you something where there's no good answer. No comment. I will not answer that. That's not a good faith question. They really don't like having in their microphone. That's not a good faith question. It never makes them look good. So feel free to identify, you know what they're doing and do it out loud. All right. Always be 15 or 20 minutes early for your interview. If you're organizing an event, be an hour early. Look directly at the interviewer. Do not look at the TV camera. You don't want to break the fourth wall. You want to look at the interviewer. Forget that the camera is there. Wear solid colors, but if you're going to be interviewed, try to avoid wearing black or white. They disappear in different lighting and particularly with backdrops. So we're queer people. Pick a color you like, one of the 7, and go for it, right? That works really well. Don't wear flashy or shiny fabric. Minimize a ton of like necklaces or jewelry. They can bounce light really funny, especially if you're being interviewed outdoors. So just keep it as simple as you possibly can. This is why interviewing drag queens at Pride is sort of a nightmare because of the jewelry. Be energetic, be enthusiastic. If you shut down and are staring at your feet while you talk the whole time, people are going to take your message less seriously, not because it's right, but because it is the way that it is, right? You are performing, so perform it. Be energetic, give yourself the space. Be sincere. So if you need to think about an answer, don't be afraid to let silence happen. They'll edit that. Just be in the silence, gather your thoughts, and then respond. You're not on a timer, right? It's not like a Super Mario, you have 30 seconds to complete. So don't rush through it. You take the time, they have to edit it. That's their problem. Be honest. If you do not know the answer to a question, say that. I do not know the answer to that, and leave it there. Don't answer a question you don't know the answer to. They'll fact check you, and that will cause you problems, not them. And then be personal, right? So as the parent of a trans kid, I disagree with this policy. That's about as much information as you need to give. Don't use your kids' names, right? Don't give your address. Minimize self-identifying information, especially when you're getting to know a reporter. All of these make a difference. You can use humor in the right place, but not sarcasm, right? It needs to be specific. So for example, When I'm talking to reporters about using Disney music to block rebel media, it's hilarious because they get so mad at the Jungle Book that it's very funny. And that is a place where we can both laugh at the ridiculousness of it, and it doesn't muddle the message. Why are they mad? Everything about it makes them look exactly the way we want them to look. Okay, having difficult conversations with families, neighbors, and coworkers. This is a little bit different, very different than having a conversation with a reporter, right? So be prepared ahead of time. Assume you're going to have a positive outcome. However, plan for a negative one. Ergo, for those of us that have spent a lot of time driving on the prairies, do not have this conversation in a moving vehicle. Seems like a little thing, but lots of people who have come out to a family member in a car remember why you don't ever do that again, right? It's a little bit intense. And so you want to create a space where you can have, and my recommendation is have this conversation for maximum an hour at a time. It is not reasonable to have a very difficult emotional conversation for 6 hours. And if we don't create a time limit, it often can lead to a conversation that's less respectful of each other than creating structure would be. And so this is important. So to have a positive, so plan for a negative outcome, set on a time, a place, and a time limit, and agree to that mutually. I would like to talk to you about this. Can we set up a time? Depending on the kind of conversation, I would do it privately and not in public. Sometimes people are less likely to examine their assumptions if they feel like they're going to be also simultaneously embarrassed. And if we have a relationship with this person, part of investing in potentially changing their mind is investing in their humanity. And this setup respects their humanity and takes seriously the conversation you're going to have in the context of their perspective. It also gives you an out. At the end of an hour, if it sucks, you're done, right? And that's a kindness that we need to give to ourselves when we're taking it upon ourselves to have these conversations. Bring up the issue and set some ground rules. I'm going to talk to you about this healthcare policy. If you start saying dehumanizing things about trans people, that's going to end this conversation. We need to talk about the policy and the issues and the structure. If you start name calling, if you yell, or me, you have to hold yourselves to the same standards on both sides of the conversation, but like set some ground rules, right? It's about respecting each other. And this will be a surprise to someone who is used to being ignored, avoided, or just treated like a hapless bigot by everyone around them who's too afraid to have the conversation. Bring it to the table, give them the benefit of the doubt. At the end of an hour, you can walk. You don't have to have the conversation again, but you may have a very different conversation if you put this kind of care and time into it. Listen and be willing to examine your assumptions, right? Sometimes what is actually happening with someone when they're afraid or disconnected from an idea, or it represents a change in the world that's uncomfortable for them, it's a lot more personal than it is about the people that they're reflecting on. So, for example, I work with a colleague named Vinny who grew up in the UK, and they often say, listen, my dad was racist my whole life. And for a long time, I avoided having that conversation with him. And then finally, when I started doing equity work, I started having this conversation with him. And what emerged is his issues around immigration in the UK had everything to do with his perception that when he was a younger child, there were less immigrants in the UK. It was just based on where he lived. And also, when he was a child, he was happier, right? At this point in his life, he'd been in an industrial accident. He was constantly in physical pain. He was looking at his retirement dwindle because of austerity in the country. And he had located immigrant populations as the position where he could blame these people separate from him, because what he recognized is he was happier as a child and the country was different then. That's a complex series of emotions, right? And so when people respond to changes in the world around them, often it's a much deeper personal fear or a loss of understanding, or they've been treated badly. They spent some time on Twitter, and that was a really difficult experience for them. We've all had that day, right? And so there is a radical principle in bringing kindness and empathy to the table to discover what that fear is doing to motivate people. This, when we're talking about family and neighbors, this is the hard stuff, but it's also the most impactful, significantly. If you're willing to examine your assumptions, we can learn a lot about each other, right? When I came out as trans, I told this story at Knox United over the weekend, but when I came out as trans, my grandfather, who was the chairman of the Roman Catholic School Board in Lethbridge, Alberta for 25 years, put his left hand on the table in front of me and said, well, the church isn't always right. I love you. What do you need? Because he'd grown up left-handed in the 1940s in a time where that was considered a sign of the devil. And the reason, and I didn't know this until this moment, that he joined the Catholic School Board was to advocate so that no kid ended up in his position of being chairman of the Catholic School Board and unable to write, right? And so This comes from a genuine place of we can provide bridges of understanding between each other because often the things that divide us are artificial. We can provide all kinds of opportunities, but we have to be willing to have these conversations. When we're afraid and isolated and under economic compression, we're less willing to give the benefit of the doubt, but it is the bravest thing that we can do. Now, the last piece of this is wrap it up. Do not get drawn into this conversation for 25 hours. It's exhausting. You're not your best in that moment, right? So have the gumption to wrap it up when the conversation comes to an end or when your time comes to an end. Conduct a conversation summary. Thank you for talking to me. Here's what we talked about. I heard you on these things. You heard me on these things. What do we agree on? When are we talking next? Right? All of us have been in a less informed place at some point in our lives, and a conversation like this would have made an enormous difference. Many of us struggled sort of haphazardly to find those answers. And we, as people who are allies, especially to queer people and queer folks doing this work, we have this incredible opportunity because queer people exist everywhere, right? We can be the bridges in our families. We can create change, right? Some people may listen to me, like my family members may listen to me about Indigenous issues in a way they would never listen to an Indigenous person. And for the allies that I work with and have the opportunity to meet every day, the conversations you're going to have are conversations that your family members might never have with me. And that is what's going to change the world. But we have to create those in those conversations, the humanization, the support and care that we want to then move things forward with, right? We assume that bravery and care are weak emotions, but they're the only things that have ever created change, right? It's much scarier to be brave for each other and to have that conversation in discomfort. So I want to encourage all of you to lean into it, but have boundaries, have capacity for it, and pick the times in which you can engage in it. All right. So we're right near the end here. I actually want to be fair to everybody's time. This is something I'll leave you with. I'll put it in the resource guide. I want you to each develop what's a key message about an issue that's facing your area. It could be broader to the province or specific to your area. And you want to develop some messaging around it where you can answer some quick questions. I would invite you to develop three, right? Three truisms or things that you can use when you can start having these conversations that would be available to you. This is a place to start, right? I I learned how to public speak yelling at drunk people in gay bars when I was 15. So every skill that we gain over the course of our lives provides this incredible network of what we can give back to others. So don't be afraid to practice these things, right? And then what would be great in your communities is set up a meeting where you develop your key messages and then do a little bit of mock interviewing with each other. Practice with parents in your area, get around and have some coffee and ask each other hard questions and talk about the issues. It's a really good way to build community. It'll help build your vocabulary. One of the most powerful things we did with the drag reading protests here in Calgary is we media trained every single parent. There wasn't a single parent that a reporter could get to who wasn't ready to answer their questions. And it was remarkable how fast the less friendly media stopped bothering because they couldn't make content on us. And it makes a really powerful difference. And remember, a lot of these protests that people are creating, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get queer people to come out in public and yell and scream for good reasons. We've been upset about some valid things, but they want to make videos of that and put it on YouTube and monetize it for advertising revenue. So one of the most powerful things we did was playing Disney music into their speakers so they can't monetize that content. And you wouldn't believe how fastly their numbers cut in half when they weren't making money on making shock and outrage content. So somebody's asking you questions you don't want to answer, turn on Spotify and put on Let It Go, ruin their whole day. It's non-violent. You don't have to be anywhere near them. They can't edit the audio and you don't even have to be close to them. It just has to get in the microphone. And so there's always an economic consideration when people are harassing marginalized groups, shock and awe marketing. This is the era. So be critical about these kinds of things. This is why when someone's asking you really inflammatory questions, yeah, because Disney music is copywritten. So the robots on YouTube demonetize it and there's nothing they can do about it. So if the robots are going to take us over one day, we might as well use them to our advantage for queer activism now. It does make a big difference. But yeah, music. And that came from drag performers. Over the pandemic, all their numbers kept getting pulled off of YouTube. So we used those playlists to start because we knew they would work. And then Disney music turned out to be very effective. And honestly, blasting the Jungle Book at fascists is hysterical because they cannot deal. They just melt down. It's amazing. So yeah, it's very, very useful. All right, so let's talk about the here and now. This is the nitty gritty. All right. So in the next little while, there are some significant changes potentially coming to legislation. Both of these two pieces of legislation have done what we call pass the first reading, which means they need to be adopted into the process of organizing bills through Parliament. So we don't have a date for when this is going to hit second reading and then be ratified in the Senate. That would be the process. Now, for example, Bill C-16, which is the bill that confirmed gender expression and gender identity into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it took 13 years for that to pass. It went into the House of Commons 5 times and into the Senate 3 times. So just because this has hit first reading doesn't mean it's guaranteed. But I want to talk about Bill C-367 and Bill C-63. These are important because this is part of the conversation we're going to be having about changing, making sure this never happens again in Canada. So Bill C-367, it's very, very short. I will provide a link to the actual documents. It's a one-pager, which almost never happens in government. All that it does is it removes the religious exemption from hate crimes designations. So what it means is you are absolutely allowed to practice publicly and support and celebrate your religious belief system. But as soon as you say something like you're going to hell because Jesus hates you, then you don't get to use religion as an excuse to justify the hate speech. Right? This is an additional consideration. Like conversion therapy opened the door to this to some extent. Now, the folks that do not like us very much are going to yell and scream from the rafters to the ends of time that this is interfering with their right to religious belief. And so I want to be very clear about what it does and does not do. It does not interfere with the right to practice your belief system in any way. It does change how hate speech can be justified on the basis of religion. Doesn't matter what religion. Right? And so this would eliminate people preaching hate at Pride, the Save Our Children rallies. There's all kinds of opportunity here. It's never been done before. When this comes into Parliament, we are going to need to push MPs to support it. It's a very important change. It also allows faith communities, and Bam and I have talked about this quite a bit, to have the conversation about like, please do not preach hate in our name, which is what this would prevent from happening. And so it does create this idea of, no, it is totally inappropriate to use faith and speak for communities of faith in a hateful way. And so there's a lot of conversation about what it means to regain a control over how faith is used and promoted in community. Right? And so this is where this opportunity lies. It's not uncomplex, but I think it's really important to understand the context when this is being proposed and where it comes from. 2, this is the Online Hate Crimes Act. So what this does is this introduces criminal charges and monetary charges. It's about $70,000 and jail time is possible for online hate crimes and online hate speech. This simply just didn't exist. Both Canada and the United States are way behind when it comes to enforcing hate speech laws online. You may be familiar with this. And so this is starting to change. This means that all of the comments about groomers and pedophiles, the banners going up on street corners, all of that becomes criminal charges with real consequences. Right now, the way that a hate crime works is, so a hate crime is an adjunct to sentencing. So what this means is, if I was walking down the street and somebody punched me in the face and called me a gay slur, which I'm not going to use because the shock value here is no real point. What happened is I've been assaulted, and then when it goes to trial, if that person used an anti-gay slur in their assault of me, then their sentence will be increased because it's an intentional assault with hate-motivated intent, right? So a hate crime is an adjunct to an existing criminal charge, not a criminal charge within itself, right? But there haven't been consequences for online hate introduced into the criminal code until now. And so this would create consequences where currently virtually none exist. And this is based on case law that's currently going through in Ontario. These 2 changes would be a total 180. It would give us teeth to defend our charter rights like we never had before, which makes them very important. So in the next probably 18 months to 3 years, you're going to hear a lot about these. It's going to make a really big difference that we can support these kinds of changes to create the communities and the country that we want to hand off to our kids, that we want to leave for people coming after us. This will make a big difference in the lives of Canadians across the board. So far, so good. This is our political strategy. This is my favorite document of the last couple of months. So since the announcements, this is what QCU, Queer Citizens United, have been working on. The education that we're doing tonight is one component of this plan. I'm going to do an overview of this plan just to give you an idea of where you could potentially contribute. Yeah, this is the gay agenda. Welcome to the gay agenda. Here it is. I didn't put Taco Tuesday on here, but I should have. All right, so the first piece is the legal challenges. There are a couple of legal challenges coming through. We are developing something called the Charter of the Rights of Gender Diverse People, a legal document that we would like to create consistently in Canada. This has never been created anywhere in the world. We have a legal team working on it. This is something that we will be asking for your advocacy on. This will enshrine rights for gender diverse people, inclusive of Two-Spirit communities, in a way in Canada that has never been done. So this is one piece of it. There's, of course, the court challenges. We're going to sue the shit out of the Alberta government for years, and we are ready to do so, which is a Drag Race reference, but it's good in this case. In addition to that, I have a group of really incredible parents and advocates who have been working in this space for a period of time that are starting to pick off the groups of Christo-fascists who have been protesting in places like Edmonton and Calgary, Lethbridge, and other areas. So we are going after exposing darkness with a legal and copyright challenge, and we will be extending that. So if you have a rogues gallery that you would like to make us aware of, we're building a case. So those are the legal cases. There are a couple of more options. With the announcement from the Alberta government, I believe the word Bennett used was dozens of law firms, including the ones that fought the Delwyn Vreemd case for federal protections in '98, have come on board. Rogues Gallery being, do you have folks in your area that are perpetrating homophobia as a collective group? Because we'd like to know about them, because we're going after them. And everybody's got a Larry Heather or a Derek Reimer in their city. We know who they are. I would like to know who they are so we can get that information together. Yeah. So we're working on that piece, right? We have civil rights in this country and we will defend them and we will find a way to do that. There is legal capacity pro bono. If there are people in your individual communities who would like to mount a legal challenge, let me know. I will find lawyers for you for free. So that's been kind of a neat last couple of weeks. The Girl Guides of Alberta also called me and were like, how can I help? So by the way, props to the Girl Guides who are all over this, which is amazing as a former Girl Guide. All right, now we've got politics. So we've noticed Nenshi is running for NDP leadership. I want to highlight, and I want to talk about data on the ground. We know that Nenshi and Pancholi are the only two people that have spoken explicitly about supporting queer people as part of their leadership platform. Lots of the other candidates have done so in their roles, and I want to recognize people like Hoffman and Kathleen Ganley, who have done amazing stuff for the queer community and recognize their work. What is important, though, is Nenshi and Pacholi. Pacholi has actually released policy saying that she will expand gender affirming care. She's the only leadership candidate to do so. And so I think there's something worth considering there. And then, of course, Nenshi's run is important. What's important about the NDP all over across the board is we need to support a strong leadership candidate, whoever you believe that is within the party, because we need to take this province back over in 2027. And that is what we are working on. So whatever we need to do to make that happen, if you have the opportunity to buy a membership, this is not an unpolitical session. We've got work to do in this province, and that's going to involve becoming politically active. And so I would recommend please get involved in your local school board, which I'll talk about, local civic elections, and pay attention to the provincial elections. It's going to make a huge difference. There was only a 1,300 vote difference in who formed government in the last election, and we can do better than that. In particular, young people need to vote. Any opportunity to do that. And for those of you that operate GSAs in smaller spaces, city councils are very important. People from 14 to 17 can vote in party leadership races. So if they would like to participate in the NDP leadership race, your GSA can. And 3 years from now, they're going to be voting age. So getting them engaged now is actually a really productive thing that we can do. So get them engaged early, build the language with them, and they will be voting age by the time we go to the polls in this province. And so this is a good time. We're going to do this, then let's do it all the way. So let's get the kids on board because this is going to affect them. Regional networks. We have broken the province into 5 regions. We have unified every single Pride and Two-Spirit organization in this province. We are having bi-weekly meetings. It is going super well. I will continue to provide information. We will continue to provide through keys. Yeah, it's been So if you know of a small town pride or an organization that's not looped in, let us know. We've organized the province into 5 zones. Those prides are adopting larger and smaller prides to share resources, and we're going to try to organize fundraisers across the province. We're winning rural Alberta over Pride season. We want to make sure that place is well resourced and ready to go. So any opportunity we have to provide that outlying support, the cities are doing really well. We need to support places like Bicycle and Tabor and Clarisholme. We need to reach out to places like Grand Prairie, and we're working on making that happen. School boards. I will be running a group of people that are going to be organizing candidacies and monitoring for all the school board elections in this province. Take Back Alberta is going for school boards, and we're going to meet them there. So if you're in a smaller community and what you have capacity to is to get engaged in your local school board, we would love for you to do that, and we would like to help support you to make that possible. So that's another piece of this. Healthcare and medical advocacy, Skipping Stone is doing an unbelievable job with the medical associations in Alberta, really leading this charge on the legal case against the province and medical health and advocacy. I feel very confident that AHS is in a position where they will be supporting us. Yes, I am working on that. That's why I need a calendar person so that we can start, let me know, so that we can start organizing exactly that. So we can organize queer convoys, which is a term we're going to have to fix, to all of the prides in Alberta so that we can bring that joy everywhere. Real gay everywhere as much as possible. And in the interim, we're going to be doing trainings like this. We want to professionalize people, give them the language, bring some queer joy into the space. Yeah, that's better. Quan voice? That's better. That could be funny. Someone's going to make a good joke out of that. Coalition building and activist education. This is a piece of what we're doing. If you reach out to 4 people, you have a conversation with someone else, this is where where rubber's going to meet the road, and we're going to make this possible, which is why I say you're the reason this is going to happen, right? I'm happy to be part of a large group of people that are helping to coordinate, but we're going to do this together. Rallies and protests. So attend rallies and protests in your local communities if you feel safe to do so. Remember, some of us are really powerful in direct action, and some of us are really powerful in indirect action. Contribute in the place that is the most meaningful for you, where you feel the safest. There's nothing wrong with that. Some of us like screaming at fascists in public, and others, I can't stand the internet. So my husband and I do different things. And it's great because collectively we provide opportunities for us to have breaks and support for each other. And we want to do that. So contribute where you feel like you can make the most impact. And then intersectional liaisons. Yeah. Let's talk to the ATA is in really good communication with us, and they're really strong advocates. So we want to talk about what protections teachers have, right? This is why the professional associations backing people up is going to make a big difference. So we want to make sure that you can do the support that you need to do without always having to do it publicly, right? Not all of us, okay, there we go. Yeah, not all of us are in a position, especially on contract or other things. So let's find ways to make that work. There are lots of anonymous ways. For example, some of the work that some of the parents I've been working with have done is just sitting in the fascist chats and monitoring them. Documenting them is incredibly valuable and has been an essential part of the work that we've engaged in. Like I said, lots of ways to contribute. Pick your safety first, and then the place you want to help second. Nothing wrong with that. So this is a general idea. And then prides. So we're doing media kits for prides. We're doing the Adopt a Pride program and making sure that we are as loud and as colorful this summer as we can possibly be. And we've got a 3-year run up to change the government in this province, and we're going to do it. So this is what we're working on. You're not alone. There's lots of really amazing people adding to parts of this. Stay connected to things like Queer Citizens United on Instagram, and we will continue to connect people. And then I believe, yeah, there it is. So that's the email that you can check out for QCU. I'm also going to put mine because Western Standards already tried to dox me, so why not? Oh, it's everybody. I'll put mine in the chat here as well if people have further questions. Oh no. And now, thank you for everybody for the little bit of extra time. I really appreciate it. This is the email where you can get connected. You can also follow QCU on Instagram. There's about 250, 300 people that are contributing to Queer Citizens United. It is genuinely a communal effort. There are lots of different people doing different things. If there's anything you would like to contribute to or get involved with, again, I definitely need someone to lead a community calendar for the province so that we can start organizing some of these pieces. I am looking for folks to join a committee related to school boards, monthly meetings. We just want to do regular monitoring. Some of these are turning over next year. Some of them will be 3 years from now. There's flexibility here, but we would like to be as organized as possible. So where you feel you can contribute is ideal. It really does make a big difference. And I want to upfront thank Pam and everyone here for the work I know you're already doing. Right? I know there's a reason that you're here and a reason you're doing the work in your communities. And it would be impossible, despite my best intentions and glitter, for me to do this in any capacity if people didn't believe in this work and weren't already doing it in the places that you are. So together, yeah, we'll make some good gay trouble. One of my favorite activists is a man named Bayard Rustin, and he was one of the architects of the Million Man March on Washington, where the I Have a Dream speech was delivered. And so he bridged this gap between the civil rights movement and the queer rights movement, and he faced all kinds of complications, especially at the time in the 60s and 70s. And my favorite quote of his is, every community needs a couple angelic troublemakers. So
Mhm.
go make some good trouble, shall we?
Thank you so much, James. This has been outstanding. I wanted to say a quick answer around somebody was asking about press releases. So we can include an example of a press release in the resources that we provide you, just so you kind of see, okay, this is kind of what it looks like. Short, sweet, impactful, a quote from somebody in your community. Also, finding media contacts is honestly looking up news people and reporters in your area, local people who cover stories, whether it's, you know, maybe global in your area or CBC in your area. They're always looking, especially around any day like Transgender Day of Visibility, Pride Week, those sorts of things. They're always looking for stories. So you'll be surprised probably at the number of things that they bite at if you can provide good information to them and they know that this is some good news, a good news story that they can jump on. You're helping them do their job, actually. I really encourage you that anybody in your community, whether they're a parent, they're a queer person, they're an ally, they're a leader, whether or not they might ever talk to a media person, this is all just really good information for any sort of conversation. And I think it's really, really helpful for us to really be prepared. Even that last thing, like having your few key messages anytime that you know you might be talking, to just be able to be prepared. Any of us can make a huge difference, like James says, whether it's writing a letter to the editor, showing up somewhere, baking cookies for your local GSA. All of it makes a huge difference. And I think that that chart that QCU, Q Citizens United, came up with really shows like, yeah, we can't do everything as one person, but we can be a little cog in the machine to make it keep going, and to be there for each other.